Ciphers and cryptograms are fun. I think it's fair to say that almost everyone has some sort of experience with trying to decipher a secret code, whether it was a real code or just a scrap of paper you might have found on the bus during a field trip, and which definitely did not actually say any of the many things you deciphered from it. But the allure of solving a puzzle that no one else has managed to work out is pretty hard to resist. If you aren't familiar with iceberg charts, the very basic gist is this. They're split into layers, with the top layers being the most well-known examples of whatever the iceberg is about, and as you go lower on the chart, you get more and more obscure, and eventually end with either the least well-known or sometimes the most disturbing entries, depending on how the iceberg is set up and what its contents are. This particular iceberg was created by Ave Lux Claritatis, so full credit goes to them. There are only a few special indicators on this iceberg, marking entries that have been solved or which have prizes for solving, but I won't be mentioning these directly since it'll be pretty clear from the entries themselves which categories they fall under, if any. This video will cover the first 4 tiers of the iceberg, with the last 4 tiers coming in a second part. Of course, as with most iceberg videos, none of these entries will be full deep dives. Each of them will probably have enough material for their own videos, at least in the higher levels, so if you're interested in any of them, you should be able to find more details. Also, as a last note, I have done my best with pronunciations. I looked up as many as I could find, but I'm definitely going to mangle some, so please forgive me, but also please feel free to tell me what the correct pronunciations are. I am genuinely interested to know. Alright, that's enough said. Let's just get into it. Tier 1. Entries on this level are pretty well known to wide audiences, at least if you're online a lot and or interested in mysteries. Each of them contain way too much information to do justice on in a video like this. However, if you're interested in any of these, know that they are huge rabbit holes with a lot of available information, and most if not all have had a great deal of work put into solving them. Cicada 3301. Starting off with an internet classic, Cicada 3301 began in 2012, and it was an example of an early ARG, or an intelligence agency recruitment program, or a group of secret hackers and or cypherpunks, or maybe Julian Assange. No one really knows. It's wild, but basically it functioned like many classic ARGs do. Solve puzzles to get clues, follow those clues to the prize, and whether or not that prize is more of a story or an actual reward just depends on the ARG. In Cicada, it was kind of both, with the winners of the first 2 puzzles supposedly being invited to participate in secret projects. The third puzzle is why Cicada is on this iceberg. This puzzle began in 2014 and started off similarly to the others, but it has stalled out upon reaching Liber Primus, a book consisting of pages written in something that looks like runes. Some of these pages have been translated, but the vast majority of the book is still unsolved nearly a decade later. Cicada 3301 is an entirely open to the public project, so if you're into code breaking or just want to take a look at the mystery, you can get directly involved. New eyes are always good in these sorts of projects because new eyes bring new perspectives. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to solve the puzzle and advance Cicada forward. Voynich Manuscript. The Voynich manuscript is another classic, but a very different type of classic than Cicada. This is a classic in terms of historical mysteries, and also in the fact that it's likely 600 years old. This codex is over 200 pages and was likely originally even longer, and it's separated into 6 sections, divided mainly by the content of its illustrations due to the reason for this entry. This book is written almost entirely in an unknown language. Although there are a few words that can be translated which are scattered about throughout the codex, the vast majority of the book is written in an unknown script with approximately 20 to 30 characters, depending on how you define the characters, whether you count symbols that are only used once, etc., etc. This language has been the subject of many studies and translation attempts, including the analysis of the characters used and their patterns, the letter frequencies, all of the standard code-breaking stuff that I'll go a little more in-depth in different entries. Although the general consensus from this research is that the book is written in a language rather than being gibberish, it's still highly contested as to what language this might actually be. And it is always still possible this is a hoax. The entire manuscript is available in Yale's digital collection, so if you're curious or want to take a shot at deciphering it, it can be viewed at a link that I will put in the description. Zodiac Killer Ciphers. The Zodiac Killer is... oh my gosh, I'm not even going to go into the Zodiac Killer too much. Y'all know too much about it, other people know way too much about it, so I'm just going to go through the very, very basics. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer active in the 1960s and early 1970s, and is on this list because of 4 particular letters sent to the San Francisco Chronicle and the Vallejo Times Herald. These letters are written in code, and are known by the number of characters in the codes, so the 4 are called Z408, Z340, Z13, and Z32. Z408 was solved first, within about a week of being published, by the married couple Donald and Betty Hardin. They decoded the long message, which unfortunately revealed very little of use to the actual investigation, but it did give some insight into the killer's thoughts and motivations, as well as reveal a distinctive misspelling of the word paradise. This misspelling also appears in the other solved cipher, Z340, which was recently decoded by Sam Blake of Australia, Jarl van Eyck of Belgium, and David Oranchek of the USA in late 2020, 51 years after it was sent. Unfortunately, like the other cipher, this one didn't contain anything of particular use, at least not so useful as, say, the Zodiac Killer's identity. The remaining two ciphers, Z13 and Z32, remain unsolved, although many potential solutions have been proposed. This is yet another mystery where all the tools someone needs to get involved are readily available. However, with how short these remaining two ciphers are, there's some question of whether they could ever accurately be solved. Phaistos Disc. The Phaistos Disc is a clay disc discovered in the island of Crete, found in a Minoan palace in 1908. The disc itself is dated to the 2nd millennium BC, which is from about 2000 to 1000 BC, so the disc is approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years old. The disc was found in a basement room of the palace, and interestingly, another tablet was found close by, also written in a particular undecipherable language. PH-1 was written in Linear A, which is another contemporaneous language that has yet to be translated. But although there are several examples of Linear A, the Phaistos disc is more unique. Only one other artifact, the Arcalacori axe, seems to share any symbols in common with it. The disc's character system appears to be some form of hieroglyphics, and due to the patterning of the stamping on the disc, we know that it was likely read right to left from the outside into the center of the disc. However, other than that, there's very little understanding of the language's structure, let alone any translation for it. Although many translations have been attempted and a few have been published, there's no actual agreement on them, and it's generally believed that the sample size for this language is so small that it's not going to be possible to make any definitive translation attempts. However, if more examples of this script were found in the future, then it might be possible to decode. Tier 2. These entries are slightly less well known, but they're still pretty commonly discussed, and many still have dedicated communities working on solving them. The Dagapeyev Cipher. The Dagapeyev Cipher is a practice cipher published in a book on code breaking called, very creatively, Codes and Ciphers. The author, Alexander Dagapeyev, included a few different practice and challenge ciphers in his book, but this particular one has not only remained unsolved, but Dagapeyev himself has said he's forgotten how to solve it. There have been several proposed methods to approach the cipher, as well as observations and analysis done on the cipher's text itself. These include calculating the index of coincidence, which is a measurement of how frequently particular letters or symbols appear in pairs when compared to a purely random distribution. Think of this like in English, we often have double L, we often have ER, we often have ST, and these are much more common pairs of letters than other random pairs would be. They also looked at letter frequency, which is how often particular letters or symbols appear compared to the overall text. This, again, to give an example, would be something like English E, appearing at about 13% of the overall letters in a standard bit of English. By looking at the letter distributions, you can often identify not only if it's a language, but which language it might be. These tools are very, very useful in this way. However, doing this analysis on this particular code led to a very flat letter frequency. Basically, each letter appeared more or less the same amount of time as other letters. This indicates that something has been done that makes this not just a simple substitution, and since a portion of this book describes a particular technique that uses null characters, where characters are inserted after the enciphering that have no real meaning, you just are known to throw them out. That would account for the very flat letter frequency and also make it very hard to decode going backwards. Dorabella Cipher. This is a cipher created by composer Edward Elgar, written to his friend Dora Penny in 1897. The name Dorabella comes from a musical piece that Elgar later dedicated to Penny, which he had called Dorabella. The cipher itself was included with a letter, and Dora never figured it out. It's made up of U-shaped squiggles of various orientations, sometimes with multiple squiggles put together to form letters. Think of it like W's or Greek epsilon. Various translations and methods of translation have been proposed, with varying degrees of intelligibility, but there's no consensus on which, if any, are correct. Kryptos. Kryptos is a sculpture, and it is beautiful. I definitely suggest looking at pictures of it. I should have one up on the screen now. It is a sculpture shaped like an S, kind of like a piece of paper or an unfurled scroll, and it's inscribed with 4 different ciphers. These ciphers are inscribed all the way through the material of the sculpture, which allows sunlight to shine through the characters. It's a really beautiful piece, and it's installed on the grounds of the CIA's Langley, Virginia location. All of the ciphers are written in the Roman alphabet, and 3 of the 4 have been solved, but the 4th still remains unsolved. The solving of the first 3 is a whole rabbit hole to look into, with multiple people claiming to be the first, and each claim being undercut by another claim, and it's very silly. It does seem that the first 3 puzzles were likely solved back in 1993, or at least the early 90s in general, although it wasn't until 2005 that a logician named Dr. Nicole Friedrich realized there was a mistake in the translation of the second cipher, and this mistake was confirmed by the sculpture's creator, Jim Sanborn, later in 2006. The 4th cipher is still unsolved, despite several clues having been given by Sanborn, including a few different words and their translations. The latest clues were released in 2020, so this is still a very recent development. Shugborough inscription. In Staffordshire, England, there's a monument called the Shepherd's Monument. This monument was made in the mid-18th century and features a depiction of the Shepherd's Arcadia, a painting by Nicolas Poussin in the early 1600s. Below the carved image on the monument, however, is the reason for this entry. There's an inscription that reads, OUOSVAVV, and it's framed by a D just below and to the left of it, and an M just below and to the right. A few theories have been proposed for what this might mean, but they mainly focus on it being an acronym for a few different potential phrases in Latin. However, without any more information, a nearly endless number of potential acronyms could be possible. But keep Latin acronyms in mind because we'll come back to them later on in this iceberg. Robert Morris's Written Mnemonics. Written Mnemonics, or its full title, Written Mnemonics, illustrated by copious examples from moral philosophy, science, and religion, is a book published in 1860 by Robert Morris, a Freemason who led a group called the Conservators. Freemasonry is an organization sometimes called a secret society, in which people who join are encouraged to keep the rituals and ceremonies to themselves. The Conservators, however, wanted to standardize Masonic rituals across different states. As it was at the time, everyone in different states had kind of their own little versions of things. So in order to do that, they wanted to publish a book. However, they didn't want just anyone to be able to read their rites, so they decided to put it in code. In addition to being in code, this book was most likely written in a shorthand, so that people who knew the rituals could be reminded of them by looking at the abbreviated forms, but even if you were able to decipher it, if you weren't a Mason, you wouldn't know what you were looking at. However, this still caused quite a bit of controversy at the time. Although it's likely that the key to decode this still exists somewhere, it's not available to the public, and so this is still a mystery. Markovian Parallax Denigrate. Connoisseurs of the Internet mystery are likely very familiar with the Markovian Parallax Denigrate mystery, and it's considered one of the oldest Internet mysteries, taking place in early August of 1996. This particular mystery took place on Usenet, which, for people who were not born at the time, it's kind of like a cross between a mailing list and a forum and Reddit. Basically, you would subscribe to a particular mailing list, people would respond to the topic, and everyone subscribed to that topic would get these messages. So on this day in 1996, many threads in the alt.religion.christian.boston-church topic received messages that all shared the same subject line of Markovian Parallax Denigrate. Each message was made up of different, seemingly random words, all smashed together into big paragraphs of nonsense. The fact that each of the words individually made sense, but made no sense in context together, made the messages have a really creepy and weird feel to them. The story of the investigation into who sent these messages and why is a little weirder than you might expect. Barely Sociable has a great video on the topic, so I won't go into it in depth, but it involves like mistaken identity and I think government workers. I don't know what. It's weird. It's been a while for me, but it's a ride. His conclusion is now also the generally accepted one. The Markovian Parallax Denigrate was most likely a test of an early spam bot, and it probably used a Markov chain to generate its text, hence its name. Gordon Rugg's manuscripts. Gordon Rugg is a computer scientist who created both the Penitentia manuscript and the Ricardus manuscript. Penitentia was made to specifically go against common assumptions used in code breaking, and Ricardus was made as a test to reproduce something in the style of the Voynich manuscript. Penitentia is 16 pages long. It's written in black and red characters made up of horizontal and vertical straight lines. Some of these go the full length of the character, and some are more like half dashes or accent marks. It's hard to describe, it's better to just look at it. Ricardus is 8 pages long, and it looks very similar to the Voynich manuscript, complete with drawings of plants and a script with the elegant looping style of the Voynich manuscript. I looked a little bit into both of these manuscripts and attempts to decode them, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of interest. In fact, the page on the hideandrug.com website for these doesn't even exist anymore. I had to use the Wayback Machine to find information on the manuscripts, and if there's some reason they were removed, I'm not sure what it is. Since the original links were dead and the Wayback Machine didn't have caches of all of the images, I did search around to try to find full copies, but I was only able to locate the Penitentia. It exists in a Git repository of somebody called George117, who also detailed their attempts to solve it, so it's available for anyone who's interested. Noita Cryptograms. Platforming roguelite game Noita was published in early access in 2019. I had never heard of this game before, but it has glowing reviews and it looks so neat. But in addition to the main gameplay, the reason that Noita is on this iceberg is the fact that it has 9 secret messages hidden within different levels of the game. The code is made up of eyes looking in different directions, and the community has generally accepted that each eye is numbered 0 through 4 and arranged in groups of 3, with those groups of 3 read in clockwise order. A lot of analysis has been done, looking into the patterns of the trigrams, looking at repetitions, letter frequency, orientation of the messages, and many, many more points of interest. I was really impressed looking through the wiki for this. This community seems very, very cool. They are very dedicated and they seem to still be very active. They have a Discord server for Noita where you can join and also get involved in solving the iMessages, but please be mindful of the rules. They have several rules for how they want you to conduct yourself, so keep that in mind. Tier 3. A bit more obscure, many of these entries still have a lot of history and work put into attempts to solve them, and context and information that isn't too difficult to find, with a few exceptions. The Rahonce Codex. The Rahonce Codex, or Rahonci Codex, is a book that was first found in Hungary in the early 1800s, but the exact age of the codex itself is unknown. Testing of the paper used indicates the paper was made in the 1530s, but this doesn't indicate the codex was made then. The illustration style dates it to anywhere from the 1500s through the 1600s. The codex is written in an unknown language, although many attempts to identify and translate it have been made. These identifications vary from a dialect of Vulgar Latin to Hindi written in an unknown version of the Brahmi script, so very wide range here. But every translation produced so far has been disputed, and there is some belief that the codex may just be a hoax. However, in 2011, 2 individuals, Levante Sultan Kyorai and Gabor Tokai, both independently identified a numbering system used in the codex, and then they teamed up to continue working on the codex together. They now believe this is not necessarily a language, but more likely a cipher, and so requires code breaking rather than linguistic translation. Ricky McCormick's Encrypted Notes. A true crime case this time. In 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick was found murdered in a field in Missouri. In his pockets were 2 notes, each seemingly written in code, and they were enough to stymie the FBI, which finally asked for public assistance in 2011. It's unknown what the notes might contain and whether they're related to the investigation or just completely unrelated, but either way, the FBI is very interested, not just to be sure that they aren't related to the investigation, but to figure out what code they were written in and why it was so difficult to solve, so they've asked the public for help. As a note, if you look into this is a bit of a weird case. Everything I looked at kind of contradicted itself, even right down to the idea of whether McCormick could write or not. Some places said he was known as a child to write things in code. Other places said that he could barely write at all, and I don't know how you could possibly have such different facts in different articles. So keep that in mind when you look into this if you're interested. But if you're looking for a weird true crime rabbit hole, this might be particularly interesting, especially because of the weird reporting. Beale Ciphers. The Beale Papers are a pamphlet published in 1885, telling the story of a local innkeeper who had been given a box of papers by someone named Thomas Beale. As the tale goes, the innkeeper opened the box 23 years later, found 3 encrypted papers, and then later gave them to a friend. This friend tried to solve the papers, failed, and eventually published them as the Beale Papers. If this story sounds a little silly, you are not the only one thinking that. It's been suggested that this story was probably made up by the publisher of the papers, James B. Ward, most likely to sell pamphlets, which did indeed cost a small amount of money. Some evidence for this is that one of the 3 ciphers was solved before the publishing of the Beale Papers, and it just so happens to be the one detailing the hiding of a treasure estimated to be worth $43 million as of 2018. This enciphered message that was decoded says that the instructions for how to find the treasure is within the 2 encoded documents, still yet to be deciphered. So that sounds suspicious in itself, but also analysis of everything from the number frequencies to the writing style of the pamphlets to the words used in the decoded message all indicate this is likely a hoax. However, it can't be ruled out that the papers are legitimate, and if they are, then there's a hidden treasure out there somewhere waiting to be found. Fair Game Credits Code. The 2010 movie Fair Game is a fictionalized version of real events, following a CIA agent and her husband who is a diplomat, and they both get involved in a whole slew of political scandals and intrigue. According to Wikipedia anyway, because I haven't watched this movie. But what matters for this entry is that the credits of Fair Game supposedly contains a code. The credits font is in white, except for seemingly random letters written in yellow. One particular yellow character is unknown since it's part of a redacted name, but the other letters have been compiled into a short code that can easily be found. Letter frequency indicates this is probably a simple substitution cipher, although it's possible that the code is the wrong code entirely. A comment made to an article about the code suggested that it was the letters after the yellow letters that were important, not the yellow letters themselves. Not a lot of work has been done on this code. I think that recent activity of just transcribing the code was from February of this year, so it's a potentially simple code as well, which means it's probably a good one if you want to just jump straight into something and work on it. Codex Seraphinianus. Although similar in many ways to the Voynich manuscripts, the Codex Seraphinianus is a much more recent publication. It was published in 1981, created in late 1980 by an Italian artist, Luigi Serafini. It's 127 pages of an unknown language and many, many very cool illustrations, broken up into 11 chapters. The language itself has elements of various language groups, and Serafini claims he wrote it without any intentional meaning into the language itself. He was instead trying to evoke the feeling that children might have when they would see a book written in a language, or just any language if they hadn't learned to read yet, and they would know that there was information there, but they wouldn't be able to decipher it. That was the feeling he wanted to try to evoke. However, he claims that it has no direct translation, but despite this, Alan C. Weschler and Ivan Dzerzhansky both claimed that the page numbering system was decipherable and was a variant of Base 21. Because this could be decoded, that indicates that the language itself might also have some sort of meaning that is possible to be decoded. The language itself does follow a few patterns, including capitalization and letters used only at the beginning or ending of some words, which is a feature of a few different languages, and so there is evidence for a language with meaning. Either way though, the book itself is a very neat piece of art. Feynman ciphers. Returning briefly to Usenet, this next entry was posted in December 1987 to the Psi.crypt board by Chris Cole, who stated that when he was a graduate student at Caltech, Professor Richard Feynman gave him 3 ciphers. Feynman had said that these ciphers came from a former colleague at Los Alamos Lab, but he was never able to solve them. Cole couldn't solve them either, so he posted them publicly, and within a day, scientist Jack Morrison from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory had solved one of the ciphers, which had been named Easier. It was read by looking at the last letter, moving 5 letters up the message, so to the left and up, and then reading that letter and then repeating. Once you were through the whole block, you would start at the second to last letter and repeat the process. The contents of the decoded code is simply the opening of the Canterbury Tales, so nothing super interesting in there, but cool that it was solved. However, although Easier has been solved, the other 2 messages, one named Harder and one named New Message, still remain to be decrypted. Unfavorable semicircle. This is another entry that internet familiar viewers might recognize because Unfavorable Semicircle was weird. Unfavorable Semicircle was a mysterious YouTube channel created in March 2015, and which was eventually suspended 11 months later in February 2016. However, Unfavorable Semicircle didn't stop there, and was found to have a Twitter and another YouTube channel, which were discovered by decoding a cipher originally posted by the Google Plus account, remember those, associated with the original Unfavorable Semicircle channel. Both the Twitter and the new channel were deactivated in 2017. Unfavorable Semicircle caught attention both for its frequency of uploads and for the contents of its videos, which were very similar to the other mysterious website that had been identified not long before, WebDriver Torso. On a side note, WebDriver Torso, really weird name, but it was an official YouTube testing channel. That was the initial belief for Unfavorable Semicircle, but as it continued posting, people began to think it was a little bit more. It's way too complicated to go into depth on any of the videos here, but most consisted of strange shapes, colors, noises, and even voices. Most of the uploads' titles started with the Sagittarius symbol, the little Sagittarius emoji, followed by characters that may or may not spell out intelligible words, but which don't really make any sense in context or together. Because of the way that this channel posted, as well as the cryptic messages posted to its Google Plus page and the general belief that there's something to be solved with the videos, this means that this is most likely an ARG. However, it could be an art project, it could be something else. People have even suggested it's some sort of number station. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but who knows, weirder things have happened on the internet. Very little of Unfavorable Semicircle itself has actually been solved, but the project has a dedicated wiki and a Discord server for anyone interested in lending their skills to the mystery, and they do have kind of an open call for anyone who has skills they think might be able to apply. So if you are interested in Unfavorable Semicircle, go check them out. Yuan Dynasty coins. In the 1960s, a collection of 6 gold coins were found in China. Believed to have been created in the Yuan Dynasty, which lasted from 1271 to 1358, these coins feature inscriptions on the front and back. On the front is the name of a king, written in a form of Arabic, but the writing on the back of the coins is still untranslated. There's a reward for this one, so if you're familiar with ancient forms of Arabic, it might be worth checking them out. Encrypted diaries. This is a kind of a general entry encompassing 4 different diaries which were written in code. Each uses a different style, but it's most likely these are all simple letter substitutions with created alphabets. There isn't a lot to say on these, except that they might be a good place to start for someone wanting to practice, and presumably the posters only uploaded pages they were willing to risk being read, but still, read at your own risk, lest you get elaborately rickrolled, or worse, you lose the game. Tier 4. These entries are still fairly well known, but many may have some sort of strange twist to them that either complicates the solving of the cipher themselves, or casts into doubt whether there's actually anything there to solve. Tamam Shud. This entry is related to the mystery of the Somerton Man, a former John Doe whose body was found on a beach in Australia in 1948. This is a wild mystery, but DNA evidence has, as of 2022, indicated that the Somerton Man was likely a man named Charles Webb. But who the man was and why he had ended up on that beach had become a hugely famous mystery for its many strange elements and twists and turns. One of those strange elements had to do with a paper found in the man's pocket, which read simply Tamam Shud, a Persian phrase that means something along the lines of "it's finished," although exact translations vary. This piece of paper was later found to have come from the Rubaiyat of Amar Khayyam, a book of poetry written in the 12th century. This torn page was eventually tracked down to its originating book, which had apparently been thrown into the backseat of a car, although reports seemed to vary on that. But however the book was found, it was linked to the case by this missing page, which was interesting on its own, but the book itself also contained a telephone number and a handwritten note, seemingly written in code. The code itself has never been deciphered, and since it's so short, any translation would be very difficult to verify since there could be many, many possible decryptions. However, a recent theory based on the tentative identification of Carl Webb is that these notes were just shorthand for keeping track of bets made on horse races, which was something Webb was said to be fond of participating in. Oliver Levasseur's treasure cryptogram. The 18th century French pirate Oliver Levasseur was executed for piracy in 1730, but not before making a dramatic declaration minutes before his death. Throwing his necklace into the crowd, he declared that his treasure was waiting to be found by anyone who could understand the directions, which were contained within the necklace and written in code. But here's where it gets extra sketchy beyond just the claims of a pirate. The necklace itself, along with the page where the cryptogram was written, had been lost, and the first real record of it occurs 200 years later in 1934, when French treasure hunter named Charles de la Roncière published it. He also solved the encryption, deciphering the cryptogram into plain text written in French, but the contents were a folk recipe, not directions, indicating this was kind of an elaborate troll, but it could have possibly been mistranslated, and that's the hope that people are going on. It's also worth noting that a second version of the cryptogram has appeared around the internet recently, which contains more information, though this one is a pretty obvious fake. Yogsi. This entry refers to a somewhat famous true crime mystery that occurred in Germany in 1984. I won't go too in-depth into the crime itself. Again, it does have a lot of weird little elements to it, but it involves the death of a man named Günther Stoll, who was found injured in his car on the side of Autobahn 45. Although the men who found him called for help, Günther sadly died en route to the hospital. The details of what happened or what might have happened are wild, and the investigation revealed that Günther was likely hit by a car while walking, moved, and then left in his own car by some unknown person. The men who found Günther said that, when speaking with him, he had told them that there had been 4 other people with him who had all run away. This, combined with statements from Günther's wife, who said that Günther had told her he was in danger from them, has led to a whole lot of speculation about what might have actually happened, but no real conclusions. This case is on this iceberg because, just before he left his home, Günther declared, "Now I've got it," and then wrote down Yogsi, He crossed the letters out immediately afterwards, left for the pub, and then was later found on the side of the Audubon. To this day, no one knows what Yolkse means, if anything. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 90. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 90, which I'll just call 90 going forward, is a piece of papyrus found in 1897 near Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. Over 5,000 documents from this site have been catalogued, and many, many more still exist. Most of these papers are administrative documents, such as receipts, recipes, and contracts, things which are really interesting and really helpful for learning about the society of the time, but don't contain anything usually that is a major revelation. 90 is one of these pages, written in Greek, and details the deposit of grain into a public granary. However, it's on this list because the last 2 lines of the receipt are unintelligible. They're written in Greek letters, but are neither Greek themselves nor a Greek transliteration of Egyptian Demotic. It's believed that they could be a potential cryptogram or cipher, a writing practice, or who knows what else, but their meaning is still completely unsolved. James Hampton's script. James Hampton was born in 1909 in South Carolina, and he worked various jobs throughout his life, including serving in the Air Force. For the last 18 or so years of his life, he worked as a janitor for the General Service Administration in Washington, D.C., but unbeknownst to everyone who knew him, he was also secretly working on intricate and beautiful art projects. After his death in 1964, when his art was discovered, it was also found that he had kept a journal that was written in an unknown script. Although there is some English included in the 108 pages, the majority of the pages are undecipherable. Mark Stamp of San Jose University maintains a page with a full transcription of the journal, using letters and numbers to represent the language as symbols. This transcription is available for anyone interested in analyzing it. Scorpion letters. This entry was another one where I thought it would be easier to get clear information, but unfortunately it's a little bit of a mess, so please forgive me if I got something wrong here. In 1991, John Walsh, the host of the popular show America's Most Wanted, received several letters from someone claiming to have committed 23 major crimes, including murder. These letters contained a few English messages signed with the word scorpion, along with an image of a scorpion, a very cute image of a scorpion, and also included several cryptograms. Only 5 messages were actually released to the public. 3 were in clear text, and 2 were ciphers. There are supposedly at least 3 more ciphers that have not been released. Although there have been many attempts through the years to decode the messages, especially by amateur sleuths, and even more especially by those who believe Scorpion and Zodiac are connected, that was a whole interesting place to spiral into. You can find some really weird conspiracies on this stuff, but none of these solutions have been accepted. The cryptograms had an unusually high number of unique characters. Instead of the repetitions you would normally see in a simple substitution cipher, it's been suggested therefore that this may be a homophonic cipher, which is a type of cipher that represents the same letter with several different symbols. Although it is possible to decipher this type of encryption, it is much more difficult than a simple substitution, and with the limited samples, it's debated whether or not it's possible to solve these cryptograms at all. Malvern cipher. Joseph Malvern was a cryptographer for the U.S. Army who in 1915 issued a challenge cipher which has never been solved. It's theorized that this cipher may have been encoded using a cipher wheel, a device invented by Thomas Jefferson around 1795. This wheel is made up of 36 plates, with each plate having 26 letters printed around its edges. To use the wheel, the discs would be lined up on one row to create the message to be sent, and then any one of the other 25 sets of corresponding letter rows could be chosen to be the encoded message. This way, whoever received the message, if they had a copy of the same wheel, they would just line up their message and then they would look around the wheel until they found one that made sense. So Malvern's cipher, although it looks very simple, resisted all usual known methods of being broken, which pointed to the use of the wheel, since it wouldn't necessarily be susceptible to standard methods like letter frequency analysis. However, in the book Unsolved, The History and Mystery of the World's Greatest Ciphers from Ancient Egypt to Online Secret Societies by Craig P. Bauer, a cryptologist within the NSA, he suggested that there may be an additional wrinkle in decoding this cipher. The original book that it was published in may have transcribed it incorrectly. He tried to find the original copy in the archives, but he was unsuccessful, and so it's kind of left up for debate whether we have the correct version or not. This means that the original cipher is still there to be solved, but it may have an extra layer of challenge to it beyond its original intent. River Witham sword inscription. There are 2 ancient swords found in River Witham in England, but this entry refers to one called the Knightly Sword. This was discovered in 1825 and is believed to be from the late 1200s, and it was likely made in Germany. The reason it's on this list is that the blade of the sword is inscribed with NDXOXCHWDRG HDXORVI, with plus signs at the beginning and end. Although no solution has been accepted yet, the historian Mark van Hasselt compared the sword with a Dutch sword that bears similar inscriptions. He proposed that the beginning of the inscription stands for Nostrum Dominus or Nomine Domini, which means our Lord or name of the Lord respectively. Further attempts to figure out the meaning of the inscription were made by Stieg Hedlund, who dived into things even deeper, and I highly suggest going and reading his whole process. It's very, very interesting. But the general idea here was that he focused on the letter W, which was not a letter used in Latin. He concluded that this W might be an initial, and so looked for people who lived in that time period, would be well off enough to own such a nice sword, and whose name started with W. His final conclusion was that this was likely a coronation sword presented to Willem II, King of Germany and Hainault, but again, I highly suggest you go read how he got to this conclusion. It's really interesting. The Devil's Handwriting. In an 1896 book called The Devil in Britain and America, author John Ashton details a mysterious cryptogram claimed to have been written by the devil. As the story goes, a man named either Ludovico Spolitano or Ludovic of Spoleto, I saw both, couldn't tell which one was which, summoned the devil and asked him to write a clear answer to some questions that he posed. Apparently, the pen lifted and began to write on its own, producing a very charmingly Satan-themed cryptogram. John Ashton's book references the source of this story as being a 1539 book called Introductio ad Chaldaicum Linguam Syriacum atque Armenicum at Decem alias Linguis, written by Tesio Ambrogio degli Albanese. Albanese was fascinated by languages in particular, and was given the supposed devil's script by Guillaume Postel, who, among many other things, studied language. The script itself hasn't been deciphered, but if it has a translation, it likely translates to either Latin or Italian, since both languages were prominent in the time and place it comes from. Whether the devil wrote it, if it was a cipher misinterpreted as being the devil's work, or if it was created as a hoax is anyone's guess, but some of these explanations might be slightly more likely than others. And that concludes Tier 4, and along with it, this video and my struggles with all of these names. I knew about half the entries from each tier since I've had a passing interest in this field for a while, but I'm curious about what y'all might have known or not known for this chart, and I'm also really curious to hear if anyone has worked on any of these ciphers before, or otherwise has first-hand experience with any of them. Also, again, if I've majorly screwed something up, please let me know nicely. I did my best, but I am definitely interested in actually learning something if I had something wrong, so please feel free to mention that. Part 2 will be the next 4 layers of this iceberg, which is the last of it, as I said before, so I'll hope to have that up relatively soon. No promises. But that is it. I appreciate you making it to the end of this video, and thanks for watching.